Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is a katana from Sabersmith, and before I get into it, as I often do, some disclaimers at the beginning. One, this is a secondhand sword, one that I picked up in a trade some years ago from a trade. So I did spend my own money on it, but I did buy it secondhand, and it may not be representative of what you buy if you were to get one from Sabersmith today. The other bit is I do study Japanese-style swordsmanship and other types of swordsmanship, but I don't fancy myself an expert either in swords or swordsmanship, but I've rambled about it and done it for a minute, so take that for what it's worth. Anyway, keep all that in mind as you hear my babbles throughout the course of this video. So what is the sword, what's it sold to do, and how much is it? Those are the three things I can start with right here. This is a katana made in the United States out of 1075 steel, heat-treated supposedly in-house. And I say that only because I have no way of personally validating what it's made from, not because I doubt that, well, that the materials used are what they are. The other bit to note is that this is sold as an artistic interpretation of a katana, and I feel like they're pretty honest about that in their ad copy. I don't think anyone is buying something from Sabersmith and expecting necessarily something other than what they're getting, though I could see how if you're expecting something a little bit more in line with traditional katana geometry, you may be disappointed. Hopefully this video adds some clerical points there. Anyway, I think Sabersmith is pretty honest in their ad copy about what it's supposed to do, and that is sword-like activities. You want to cut pool noodles, tatami mats, zombies as they say, but not cutting down trees. And so I think they're pretty honest about what it's for, what it can do, what the capabilities are, and what it's made from. I also would note that it's sold as an artistic interpretation of a katana, that they take influence, and perhaps in silhouette it looks like a katana, but up close there's a lot of differences where it departs from tradition. And that's okay. I don't think Sabersmith is beholden to making a katana exactly as they were in the past, and I'm glad that they call out that it is a departure. So anyway, I'll talk about some of those points, what makes them different later on in this video. But the point is they are not sold as traditional swords, and so I'm not holding them to that standard, and I think they're honest about it as well. Cost is $650, I think. I found something very close to this on their website for $650, so I'm going to assume it's in that ballpark, which means it's not low-end. Budget swords can be had for under $200. You can buy a katana that's functional and sharp and likely okay for that money. $650 puts it in the kind of low middle end of, or low mid-range of swords. So it's not nothing. At the same time, it's far from the bottom. So I'm going to go on with the BitBob fit features. You'll see me cut with it a little later in this video, and then I'll wrap it up and tell you if I think it's worth it or not. And hopefully this is helpful. So as I do, I'll start with the Kashira, the end cap, the pommel right here. And this, I think, is a little bit more in line with the pommel. I'm not sure exactly how this is connected, but this feels like one metal chunk rather than a cap that might wrap around on a Japanese-style sword. It doesn't move around whatsoever. Nearest I can tell, there's no ito or anything tied through it, so it's not fixed in a way that a Kashira typically would be on a Japanese-style sword. That said, it's durable and certainly can thump somebody in the head or functions aesthetically as what a Kashira would. It also doesn't have any jagged lines or anything like that on it. So if I try to handle the sword, or if I'm using it, my fist is a little bit more towards the base of the sword, or this is riding in the meat of my hand, nothing sharp, nothing bites me. The transitions here, more or less the leather wraps around this Kashira area and it creates some lumpy, bumpy stuff. Now, ideally in a Japanese sword, again, aesthetically, I prefer where the Kashira lines up perfectly and then there's no lumpy, bumpy ito bits here. But this is obviously not quite the same thing, so I'm not sure what standard to hold it to, other than I would personally prefer if there weren't some extra lumps and whatnot here. That said, I do actually kind of like the aesthetic of this very simple Kashira. I'm glad they didn't just put a lump of metal. There's some dimension and texture and some grind line, something that shows a little bit of character here, even though it's more or less just a simple fitting. Moving up to the handle, the grip area, I should say, of the handle. This is wrapped with leather ito, and as far as I know, they offer a few different wrapping options. This one has kind of something of a battle wrap, where it's not wrapped in the middle, and there's a few different types and styles that they do. It's worth noting that this is kind of an octagonal grip shape a little bit, and so it indexes pretty well. I know where the edge is. It locks into my hands pretty well as well. If I hold it in one hand and try to twist it, it doesn't twist in my hand. That's something that I do. I find if I hold my hand out, hold it in one hand, index it, and then try to twist it with my other hand, if I can get it to move around a lot, that's a sign that if I'm striking harder things that provide some resistance, that the blade may turn in my hand. I may lose my grip and have to adjust. It's not a terrible thing necessarily, but ideally it really locks in and secures itself to the hand. This shape, I think, lends itself to it. Anyway, There are different wrapping options and I think different grip options. I don't know about shape-wise, but I have seen that they do a little bit more of a conventional leather wrap. They can use some agawa, they can put in some braided wire and whatnot. There seem to be a number of different options to aesthetically change this to something that you might prefer a little bit more. This one, though, is comfortable. I really have no complaints about how it feels in my hand. The ito, as well, is not super tight. I can move some of it around, but whatever they've done to secure it, really, it doesn't move very much. And so as I'm moving the sword, as I'm swinging it, there's not anything that's like moving or shifting in my hands. That's an important thing that doesn't necessarily come through in a lot of photos. If the ito or the wrap on the sword is loose, it's really hard to feel in control of the weapon. And so as you're swinging it around, you find yourself white-knuckling the weapon. You find yourself fatiguing relatively quickly because you're fighting against this loose, kind of slippery surface that's trying to make the sword slide out of your hand, which is uncomfortable. So point is, that doesn't exist here. But in terms of wraps, the diamonds do wander in terms of location. They zigzag up and down, and they vary in shape a little bit, and some of them are a little clumsy looking. Ideally, in Japanese-style swords, they are pretty crisp and clean. The diamonds are all in one location. They're all consistent in terms of size, and they don't wander in the location. As it is, though, for a sword in this price point, generally speaking, swords, well, under $2,000 or $3,000, with a very rare exception, have good ito. So it's not even uncommon in the sword range of $650. But if some better wrap could be done, that would be neat. Otherwise, I do generally like this leather over leather. It's a unique look, something a little bit different, and so for me, it's a little bit on the fun to see side. And I'm glad that it locks into my hand and does all the things that it's really supposed to do in terms of a grip. Also worth noting, it doesn't like slide around. I've used this in the cold, I've used this with and without a glove, and in any case, it always feels relatively secure in my hand. Moving up to where the fuchi would be, this is just leather tied around. There really isn't a fuchi, and there is a little bit of a, I don't know, where it's tied off, goes off at a cant. It doesn't have the same even symmetry that you might see on a Japanese-style sword, but it's not, so I can't complain. Well, I can, and I will, and I am, but the point is, it's different. I noted that at the beginning, but there's no metal collar or anything like that up there. Perhaps that's something or a feature that could be added. It's not something I've seen on other Sabersmith swords, though. The Tsuba, this appears to be some sort of water jet cutout or some sort of cutout Tsuba, and I like that they are not buying cheapo, crappy fittings from overseas or something like that and then slapping them on. They take the time to make their own Tsuba. They have some familiar but unique designs, and it's appreciated. This one is a little bit of a finger grinder, though, so if I choke up on the grip and I twist it around, it's going to wear into the meat of my hands. There's some sharper ledges here that could be subdued a little bit. That said, if you don't choke up on the grip, then it's not a problem, and it does certainly have a rugged and stable feeling. Other notes on the Tsuba is that it's even, and it's the blade is straight in the grip. Sometimes with budget swords, they kind of wander around a little bit or uneven. That's not the case here. There's no habaki in this case, which is a blade collar, which typically meets the Tsuba. No problem there. And the Tsuba is relatively plain. It's just cut out of one piece of steel. I would say if they're going to make them in-house, there's some opportunity to provide a little bit of dimension or something like that. And I'm not that I necessarily have an answer on how that could be achieved, but it's okay for Tsuba to taper down to thinner or to have raised rims around the edge, and I think there's just an opportunity to make something a little bolder than a plain cutout Tsuba. Not that those didn't exist historically, but often Japanese Tsubas have a little bit more dimension and panache to them. This serves the purpose, but at the same time, I think there's an opportunity to do a little bit more without a whole lot more work necessarily. One other point to note is the gap in the crossguard isn't really there. There's very little. There's a very small area, so typically a habaki would cover up a pretty large hole here. There's no habaki as I've mentioned, but there's no gap in the crossguard as well. And it's also worth noting that not having a habaki means that there's no tension, that friction fits this blade into the scabbard, which means it'll fall out if you bend over. So the habaki does some things, potentially in terms of shock absorption and some other stuff. But one thing it certainly does is hold the blade in the scabbard, or have the potential to do a little bit of a friction fit around the mouth of the scabbard. This without a habaki doesn't do that. So if you bend over because you see a piece of candy, it's possible the sword will fall out. But still, there's very little gap in the crossguard here, which is nice to see. Now I'll talk briefly about the scabbard. So this is more in line with a very simple European style scabbard. It's just a wood core, but it doesn't have the dimension of a Japanese-style scabbard, or sai as it's called, and it's simply painted wood bound with a little bit of leather up here. Now, apparently they offer frogs or some other things if you're trying to carry them in Renaissance garb. In this case, though, the scabbard doesn't work particularly well for Japanese-style martial arts. If not that many people are going to buy these to do traditional martial arts with them, but if you want to, well, you can secure this in the obi. It doesn't have a kurigata, and that's usually this piece over here that the sageo cord, or the little string thing that you see on Japanese-style swords, comes off on. And that serves a few different purposes. One, the sageo can kind of wrap around and really secure the scabbard into your belt if you want it to. It's not commonly used that way, but the kurigata serves as when you draw, you touch it, and that way you know if your scabbard is right side up or not. So if you grab it here and you don't feel that kurigata, then you know, oh, I got to turn the sword the other way. So without that, it's tougher to tell if it's upside down or not without looking at it, which is, I don't know, just not what's done. On top of that, the blade is just a little tough to do kind of classical noto with, to draw and sheathe and drop it in, and I don't know. It's not that it doesn't work, but it doesn't work well if you're trying to do traditional Japanese-style sword stuff with it, which, again, you're not. But since it's a katana, one of the things that katana are great for is drawing and slashing in one go, in one kind of blow. That's one feature that the sword tends to be predominantly used for or known for. And a scabbard like this just makes that a little bit tougher to do, or at least and put it away. In terms of holding it in your belt, it's not as uncomfortable, really. So I don't notice it so much in terms of sitting in my belt. If I have it in an obi, I can move it around, I can draw it, I can sheathe it, I can. It's just not familiar. It's a little bit uncomfortable, and at the same time, like, not uncomfortable on my hip, I should say. It sits there. It sits there okay. All right, let's talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part. And there's a lot of interesting features on this blade, namely the geometry in this hollow ground bevel here. This is not something that I would expect to see in a Japanese-style sword, but is something I see on a number of Sabersmith products. And more or less, this primary or first bevel is hollow ground. It does, I imagine, a lot to reduce some of the weight on the sword. It then has a prominent secondary bevel. Now, this secondary bevel, they did note that it's not for chopping down trees, which is unfortunate because this very robust edge that's on this one is a little bit more suited to whacking wood. And later I'll talk about the cutting. It didn't do well in cutting, but I would say that if it had a keener edge, it likely would have. Anyway, other notes about the blade. The grind lines are all really quite smooth. There's no rippling along the edge. The hollow ground is very flat and clean, as is the fuller and the bohea on either side. There are some surface ripples on the flat parts of the blade, but very, very minor. The grinding on here is really quite good. I'm not sure exactly what classification this would be, if it'd be shinogi or shobuzukure. There's no yukote on here, but it's a little bit of a, at least in silhouette, a Japanese style shape. But there's some differences. One, it's thinner down here than it is up at the tip. This actually gets to be just a little bit wider. The blade is also quite a bit thinner, so it's thinner at the base, thinner at the spine even than a Japanese sword typically would be, and that results in it being quite a bit more flexible than a Japanese style sword. It feels quite a bit more like a European style sword than a Japanese one, at least in terms of how rigid it is. The blade is finished as well in kind of a satin polish, and I don't imagine it's necessarily going to be easy to clean up, because the hollow grinding is done one way and the other grinding is done a different way. But at the same time, because it's a satin finish, you could take a Scotch-Brite pad or sandpaper and theoretically be able to clean it up, as where a mirror polished Japanese sword is a lot harder to clean up scratches and stuff if you actually use the swords. Other than that, it has, a nice imposing kind of futuristic look, and it's, to my eye anyway, easy to pull out that this is a Sabersmith blade, as opposed to, some other manufacturer. The way they do grinding and the kind of the style of the blades they have is very uniquely them, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. The other bit to note about the blade in terms of usage would be, well, rather not usage yet, let's focus on moving it around, is that this blade looks like it's big and imposing. It's rather long, and a blade this wide and long would give me the impression this is probably going to be close to a 4-pound katana, but it is not. It is 2 pounds and 11 ounces, or thereabouts anyway, and the point of balance is 4 inches from the cross. So this, some whatever metal bits are in here are bringing the point of balance down. And as a result, it moves really comfortably. If I talk about moving it around in a traditional sense, which granted this is not for, I can move things one-handed and do one-handed kind of kata, despite the fact that the blade being very long and kind of imposing looking. In two hands, I can maneuver it around, but as I've noted, some of the Scabbard features, it's a little weird to move around in some ways, but I can. And overall, it's reasonably comfortable. I feel like I have a reasonable amount of point control. I feel like I can move it in one hand and start and stop and get tip speed and control it in one or two reasonably well. It's not cumbersome or hard to move around, and a lot of that I think has to do with the lower point of balance and the fact that it's thinner, and as a result, it just moves a little bit different than I would expect a sword of this size to. That's a katana. And that is, has its part in cutting as well. So in terms of cutting, because the edge isn't terribly robust, it's not, or rather I should say it is very robust. It's not very keen though. It's sharp enough and I can cut through water bottles, but I really have to generate a lot of speed to do it. I throughout the course of cutting, did plenty of bad cuts where if this heat treatment was bad, it had the opportunity to bend and didn't. So I get the impression, because the edge hasn't dulled in the robot, well, it's a very wide edge. It's a little over 25 degrees, I think. Because the edge didn't dull or roll in some of the bad cuts that I gave, and because the blade didn't roll, I suspect the heat treatment is pretty good on it, and it would take a keener edge, and while it would be a little bit more fragile, it would certainly perform better in some of the cutting that I did. That said, I do feel the flex in the blade. It's not as forgiving as a katana would be. It's not as rigid as it is, but I can generate tip speed and whatnot. It moves a little bit more like a messer or something almost than katana, I would say, or at least in terms of how it feels in the cut. That said, the blade profile is maybe a little bit more like a messer than like a katana. Anyway, cutting wise, I really had to swing hard to get through things. I could cut pool noodles, I could cut water bottles, I could cut more robust targets, and if I really got oomph in my swing, I could make it through those targets. Sometimes it would cut well and kind of surprise me, and other times I really had to generate a lot of power in order to get it to make it through the target. But I think that's more along the lines of edge angle than really anything else. It didn't bend as well, and so that's a thing worth noting. I did have plenty of bad cuts. Other people cut with the sword on the same day as well, and they had some bad cuts, and the sword is still straight, the edge is still good, no deflections, rolling, problems, bending, nearest I can tell. It's also worth noting that I swung pretty hard at some harder targets, and I didn't feel a lot of shock in my second hand. So a lot of times I'll swing, and then I'll feel vibrations or something if I don't make it through the target in my second hand, and I didn't feel that here. So I'm not exactly sure where the nodes are, but they're such, and it's made in such a way that it doesn't hurt me if I don't make it through the target, which is always appreciated. Anyway, that's what I can share with you about moving it. That's what I can share with you about using it. Frankly, that's what I can share with you about all of this stuff. And hopefully what I've given you gives you some idea of what this sword is about and if it's worth your money or not. Now's the point where I can answer that myself. In short, yes. I would say yes, it is if you are a customer that appreciates what this sword is putting on the table, that it's a US-made blade, or that it has a particularly unique, characteristically Sabersmith look, which I think is special and good, that it's a well-built, a well-crafted thing, that it fits well with your idea of what you want out of a sword, then I can say yes, it's a well-built thing, and it doesn't seem $650 would be a ridiculous price to ask. However, if you're looking for a tool for Japanese swordsmanship practicing, if you're looking for something more traditionally constructed or of a more typical Japanese style build, then no, this is a maybe too far a departure if those are things that you're looking for in particular. But if they're not, if you could really care less about how it performs as a Japanese swordsmanship practitioner type tool, you don't care that it has geometry departures. In fact, you maybe prefer something through hardened and something a little bit more flexible, then hey, this is worthy of your consideration. I do think it's special, and one thing that I'm coming to appreciate more about Sabersmith is that they have their own look. As I've experienced more of their wares, I can easily pick them out of a lineup, and I kind of appreciate that they have their own style and their own way of doing things. It's not going to be for everyone, it doesn't have to be for everyone, but I would say that it has its place and is worthy of consideration if you like what they're offering. That's all I've got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.